From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And during his weekly grain market segment, K-State's Dan O'Brien will check in shortly to highlight the promising signs for an improved corn market, favorable indicators for harvest time wheat prices, and soybean sales to China. He'll talk about all that next. Then K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will look at in-season nutrient management for corn, options for applying supplemental nitrogen to corn stands at this stage of development, and the merits of applying sulfur and chloride to corn at this point of the growing season. And later, we'll welcome in K-State's Mary Knapp for her weekly look at the Kansas agricultural weather scene. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
It's good to have you aboard once more for Agriculture Today. Time now for our weekly grain market analysis and comment featuring grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension, from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas, of course. Let's begin on the grain export update as we have the numbers to date. Now, Dan, if one looks at those, for wheat and soybeans, they look rather lethargic, those sales figures. Corn is the notable and favorable exception, you say.
The latest numbers out from the USDA on their weekly Foreign Ag Service export report, there's 53 million bushels of corn exports that were shipped out of the U.S., and we need a pace of about 49 million to meet the USDA's projection of 1.775 billion bushels. And, you know, with a USDA WASDE report coming up, World Ag Supply Demand Estimates numbers in the next week, it's very important to have pace to give the USDA confidence in retaining and not changing that export number. And, since we're talking about corn, we have exports to the high side. There's some positive news for corn. As the gasoline market starts to do better, and oil and gasoline both moving steadily higher, you see ethanol prices at Kansas plants, according to USDA numbers, at $1.11 and had been well below $1 in the worst of it. I think it's 89 cents or something like that. And the overall U.S. ethanol, the Iowa ethanol prices had been down to about 70 cents. Now they're up to $1.10 a gallon. So you're getting that much closer to bringing at least break-even situations and the possibility of profits coming back, and or at least closer to break-even. And with that, as we're coming into the season where people are certainly anxious to get out of the house and go travel and do whatever. So all that bodes well, I guess, for where the ethanol industry goes, corn usage, and the like. We haven't heard anything yet. At least I have not heard much yet of feed grain usage dropping off. So doesn't seem to be a surprise there. You add that in to this issue of that we talked about just a minute ago of pretty strong corn exports. And, corn, which had been down to about 310, closed yesterday at about 329. And that's not 350. It's not 375 or $4. But the trend is in a positive direction. And again, we'll kind of hit on corn while we're talking on it. Crops pretty well planted, rainfall expected, nothing standing in the way yet. You do hear of changing weather patterns towards La Nina, El Nino. All that's coming into play again. Still a long ways to go before we can declare we've got a tremendous corn crop. But that tremendous 14, 15 billion bushel corn crop is, quote, out there as a risk. And that for sure has corn producers' attention. Wouldn't be surprised if we get to, if we do get to 350, 370 D's corn futures, that people will probably, given that risk that's out there, probably be pretty anxious, more anxious than perhaps normal, to look at some forward pricing. And since we're talking corn, I might mention on grain sorghum, if there's anything that you hear out in the country, it's that with stronger performance we've seen in grain sorghum exports of late, that it may be affecting acreage in the western part of the state, particularly in some of those dry areas. So we'll see. The tail of the tape is always with the seed corn dealers and the seed sorghum dealers. And I have not heard in the eastern corn belt of those reports that you hear when there's a lot of acreage switching. But we do hear some of that from our agronomic brethren here at KSU, of farmers discussing with them planting more sorghum acres. So we'll see. The sorghum weeks they tend to be up and down in terms of the pace. This most recent week, about 3.7 million bushels. Need a pace about 7.4 to hit the USDA's projections. That's kind of par for the course. I would say when you look at basis levels still in central Kansas, eastern Kansas, the Topeka and Salina basis levels are 35 over for sorghum. And the corn basis levels at the same community, as well as, say, Salina, is at about 30 under July. So that would seem to be a pretty strong signal that there's still export demand going out there, or at least the expectation of it within the industry. And when we see terminal bids that strong, they're probably not feeding it in central Kansas. They're putting on trains and sending it someplace.
So more than a few stars are aligning, it would sound, on the feed grain side, Dan. Back to the export numbers of late for wheat and for soybeans. Again, they don't impress, although there are some more encouraging signs of what may be happening with beans continuing to move to China, in spite of the political war of words between the U.S. and China of late.
Well, yes, in this row over politics and trade, which has been, those two have been hand in hand in terms of the U.S. and China here in the last year or so. China had come out in the last week or so and indicated that they were going to stop purchases of certain key products from the U.S., and I think soybeans is one of them. But then we have had reports almost on the very heels of that there were purchases made. The market moved higher yesterday on reports of strong soybean meal export demand. There are some questions, I think, out of South America that still, even with their quantities of production, coronavirus issues in Brazil that still have potential to affect their logistics. Really, news out of Argentina, some more mounting evidence that Argentina may not be able to provide as much to the market as had been thought. And I need to study those reasons more. But all of that here, you saw soybeans close up a dime yesterday, a dime to 11, 12 cents, and a little higher in the March 2021, up 12 and a quarter cents, May 21 up 14 and a half. So, that's not just a trifling 1 or 2 cents higher on people thinking there's something that might happen. Quote, those are substantial moves. So there's news in the market, worry about alternative supplies, and it is as it is. I would say that we have been watching the value of the U.S. dollar, and that has been moving to the lower side. It dropped 4, 5, 6%, and all that helps U.S. export competitiveness. So ups and downs in the export market, but on the one hand, we saw the public pronouncements that don't seem to be consistent, by China, that don't seem to be consistent with what's actually happening in the cash market. So we'll see.
As we know, the combines will be rolling here very soon in Kansas. Wheat harvest is not that far away, right around the corner, actually. And there's nothing better that a producer would like to hear than a jolt in exports. But we're not seeing that. Is that anywhere on the horizon?
Well, the latest numbers, about 28 million bushels of wheat exports. For the longest time, we were struggling at 12, 13, 14 million bushels a week, actual shipments. And here in the last week, well, right at the very end of this old crop marketing year, we jumped to 28. Coupled with news from, weather services, they're looking at hot, dry conditions forecast, and not just triflingly hot, dry, really hot and dry conditions forecast for Russia. So you saw the wheat market also moved to the high side yesterday, up, again, 14 and a half cents. Now, when we think of major moves, we think of limit moves of 25, 30 cents, but this is halfway there, and this is nothing small. So when you look at major U.S. wheat export competitors, the first place we're going is Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine, I think, still has pretty good crop prospects from what I've heard, what analysis I've seen. But now there's some question about Russia, and that's a, quote, big deal in the wheat markets.
We'll keep an eye on that. Let's squeeze in one more thing here. This is captured in your weekly notes on the grain trades as well. And you're watching closely now speculative trading in the futures. And that's often an indicator of where one might be headed in each of these markets for the forthcoming weeks. What are you seeing, Dan?
The commodity futures trading numbers come out on Friday afternoons. So the data you have is a week old and a week trailing. So the last data we have is as of May the 26th. And at that time, you still had a lot of bearishness. You saw the net spec trade position heading lower for corn. I think we see what's going on now. You don't have increasing sell positions, short positions when the market's moving higher. Here the market's been moving higher. When you see what's happened for soybeans, they had been improving for the last several months, kind of up and down. Again, I would not be surprised that by the time we see what's happened this week, that'll have moved higher. And really, the question for us is this odd situation where harvest is just about upon us in the hard red winter wheat world, and yet we saw prices jump 14.5 cents. And really the short position for the specs, although it's been bouncing around, has been trending to the positive side. Less bears, more longs. So out of all surprise, here we see the markets on the verge of wheat harvest in Kansas tending to move higher, and wheat being the strongest of all. And that has a lot to do with, yes, what we see for some damage in Kansas, but that international export competitive issue is jumping up. And when you see something like this happening, it does point out the potential for what weather conditions elsewhere in the world amongst a major wheat export competitor could do to the Kansas wheat market.
It obviously will bear watching, which we will do in our regular sessions right here every Friday. Dan, as always, much obliged.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, Dan O'Brien. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, and in the company of a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. And we've invited Dorivar to be along with us today to discuss in-season nutrient management for corn. And Dorivar, you tell us there are numerous considerations that we can and will go over here in our session today. We're looking at this from two vantage points. Those who had intended to come in with a secondary application of nutrient at this stage of the season, and those who had not necessarily planned for that, but as they see that young crop progress, now see the need.
Yes, Eric. Focusing on nitrogen, which is typically, of course, the main nutrient that we need to manage a little bit closer in corn, we typically kind of have two different situations. And one of those is what you just mentioned, producers that maybe already have their regular nitrogen application, either fall or spring pre-plant, and now getting into that corn growing season. And the question is, do we need to maybe apply some additional nitrogen? So that's one scenario that we typically deal with every year. It kind of depends on a few different points there that we'll explore a little bit more. But then you also have the other group of producers that may be already planning to do split application of nitrogen. It's kind of a part of their program. And again, all of that just depends on specific management situations, what kind of soils they are dealing with. Some of them maybe know they have some challenging soils, more sandy soils, or those heavy clays that really need to have some split application of nitrogen to benefit, and they do see some consistent benefits to split apply. So that's kind of the second situation. But how do we know if we need to apply maybe additional nitrogen? And this is really one that we need to evaluate each field separately and really kind of look at what kind of situation we have. And there are a few key factors here. One of them is what kind of nitrogen program we have. In other words, that we're putting all the nitrogen in the fall versus in the spring, and what source of nitrogen do we use? If we're talking anhydrous in the spring, for example, that tends to be pretty stable. And for the most part, chances of losing that source of anhydrous in the spring tends to be pretty low as we're getting, in late June. Still, that nitrogen will be pretty stable there in the ammonium form. Now, if we're thinking about fall apply, then the risk of losing some nitrogen is a little bit higher because that nitrogen's been there for longer. Of course, driving all of these is there are two components there. One of them I already mentioned, soil types. Then we have the weather condition, of course. Yeah. And this is something that we actually do have quite a bit of information nowadays. Mesonet, the K-State Mesonet, provide pretty good information in terms of soil temperature, which is one key factor. We don't think too much about soil temperature when it comes to nitrogen, but obviously all of this nitrogen process is driven by microbial process, microbial activity. So higher soil temperature obviously is speeding up some of these nitrification process and potentially the risk of losing nitrogen. And of course, rainfall. If we have excessive wet conditions, we may be also higher risk of losing nitrogen. Now, all of these, again, it's a lot of components, and I think every producer needs to kind of evaluate their specific situation. And in some cases, again, there is the risk of nitrogen losses. And we see in our trials pretty good benefit from additional nitrogen applications going in season. Another tool that is becoming more popular as well is the use of sensors that can tell us pretty soon now we're getting, V6, V8 corn at this point. You can start to pick up some of the deficiencies in nitrogen by using sensors. And this is something that we do have some guidelines from K-State, but also a lot of industry agronomists are providing services to evaluate nitrogen status using sensors. So that's another tool as well that can be used to make that decision.
The lead question then for those who had not initially planned on side dressing but find that they will need to do so in the near future now, at what rate would they put that in down? Do you go with a general ballpark number there, or is there a better way of narrowing that down?
Yes, that's an excellent question, Eric. And really, we do have the ways now to be very precise in terms of how much nitrogen we're going to need. We do have an estimate of how much total nitrogen needs we'll have. And again, we can evaluate what we have in the soil. We can use sensors. And again, actually with the sensors, we can come up with very specific rates that may be needed. However, on the other hand, we have to think about what's practical. If we're talking about, you need 10, 15 pounds of nitrogen, the question is it really practical to get there and do that application? So oftentimes, what I suggest and what I know most agronomists tend to do is to do a blanket application of around 40 pounds, which tends to cover kind of the minimum needs. And of course, it's not excessive as well. So that's one good option for in-season application, especially if you're already having most of your nitrogen already in place and you're just trying to complement. Now, the other question with that also is, what is the window for that nitrogen application? How late we can go and still get the benefit? And we've done in recent years quite a few studies where we're looking at, anywhere from V6 actually to tassel, VT corn. So getting to that reproductive stage. The main finding is that we can go with nitrogen pretty late still, especially these new hybrids that's taking up nitrogen later in the season, and we still get benefits. In other words, if we do have the way to get in the field, either high clearance equipment or even flying some urea, for example, we can go pretty late. And of course, producers who have irrigation, they're already doing this with fertigation. They can go, after a reproductive stage, after tasseling, and still get a benefit, especially if we are deficient in the total nitrogen application. One thing I wanted to touch a little bit also, a lot of the work we've done with nitrogen has been primarily with urea and UAN. And one thing that often could be a little bit of a concern with nitrogen in season is the potential for volatilization. In the next few days, as you see the forecast, high temperatures, windy conditions, those tend to be ideal essentially for volatilization losses. So especially if we're thinking about using urea or urea-containing source like UAN, we do have some level of risk of volatilization. So this will be the ideal situation where we really need to be thinking about using urease inhibitors as one option to minimize any losses.
Well, with corn, it's understandable why the focus should be on nitrogen. There are other elements that might prove beneficial to that oncoming corn crop too, namely sulfur and chloride. And you say those could also be considered for application soon.
Yes, Eric. And the key here is that these two nutrients that you just mentioned, they are mobile nutrients. And that's the reason why we can do in-season application with very good results. Because again, once you apply these nutrients, especially in the case of sulfur and chloride, that again, they are highly mobile. Once you have a rainfall or a way to basically move that nutrient in the root zone, basically that corn crop is going to take advantage of that. So again, those are two other nutrients that we can consider. We are seeing more sulfur deficiency in many of our soils, especially some of those soils with higher sand content and lower organic matter. Those tends to be a little bit more on the deficient side for sulfur. So definitely something to think about. The only key thing that we need to think about here for sulfur is that we need to apply in the form that's going to be available immediately. If we are doing in-season citrus application of sulfur, basically it needs to be in the sulfate form, which is going to be immediately available to that crop. There are some other options like elemental sulfur, and those are also good options. However, we do need time for that to break down and be available to the crop. So essentially, they are not suitable for in-season application. We need to be thinking about sulfate. So a lot of these would be liquid, ammonium sulfate, dry, still fertilizer are highly soluble, available to the crop. So those are all good options.
What about chloride briefly here then?
Yes, and chloride is something that we do see in Kansas, quite a bit of response, especially if we're talking about kind of that central part of the state where we do have typically enough rainfall to basically leach the chloride from the soil, but we are not putting any potash on the regular basis because we do have soil test K that are typically high in those regions. So we do have quite a bit of studies in corn and also in sorghum where we do tend to see consistent benefits to chloride. So it is something that we need to also consider, and a lot of the work that we've done with corn and sorghum has been primarily side-dressing chloride. So again, that yield response when needed is going to be there with side-dress application.
Well, in as far as in-season corn nutrient applications, K-State has amassed a wealth of information on all of what you've talked about today and more, Dorivar, and that information can be found at agronomy.ksu.edu. A host of things to think about here, and Dorivar, thanks for the input on all of this.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz with us, crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension, on in-season nutrient management for corn on Agriculture Today. And we'll return after this break. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Next up for you, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, farm groups and various officials continue to press the USDA to broaden the coronavirus food assistance program as they highlight agricultural products left out of the program. The USDA announced yesterday that the department already has approved more than $545 million in payments. Since starting the sign-up on May 26th, the USDA has received more than 86,000 applicants for CFAP. Sign-up for the program continues through August the 28th. Now, the National Association of Wheat Growers wrote USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue this week that growers of all classes of wheat should be eligible for aid under CFAP, not just the hard red spring wheat and durum wheat growers who've been covered so far. NOG noted in an April 23rd letter that all three May futures contracts for wheat had dropped at least 10% between January to mid-April. The hard red winter wheat contract falling 13.7% during that time. Soft white wheat, which does not have a futures contract, also falling 8.5%, according to USDA data. Now, on Wednesday, the administrator of the Farm Service Agency, Richard Fordyce, did a question and answer session over the phone with members of the South Dakota Corn Growers Association about the $16 billion CFAP enrollment. Representative Dusty Johnson of South Dakota said on that call that there are a number of members of Congress pushing for an additional $60 billion in aid. Johnson did not mention the HEROES Act passed by the House. It has provisions that boost that agricultural aid. The HEROES Act passed on largely a party line vote with very little Republican support. 4 U.S. senators have introduced bipartisan legislation to support farmers who want to earn income through carbon markets. The legislation could help set criteria and certification programs that would make it easier for producers to earn income from carbon credits. The Growing Climate Solutions Act, as it's called, lists significant support among a cross-section of agricultural groups, major corporations, and environmental organizations. The bill does not address broad fundamental challenges to lowering greenhouse gas emissions nationally, but for farmers and owners of forestry operations nationally, this legislation does create a certification program at the USDA that would help address technical barriers for farmers and landowners who want to participate in carbon credit markets. The bill would also promote access to technical assistance comparable to what the USDA's NRCS now provides for conservation practices. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue says that producers would, in fact, respond to such a program. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
We know quite a lot about how to use farmland as a carbon sink, how to reduce agriculture's environmental footprint.
Using techniques like cover crops and no-till types of things that can capture that.
But Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue told an Ag Innovation webcast this week that farmers are not yet fully implementing some of these techniques. So the question is,
how do we incentivize farmers to take those steps?
For years, there's been talk of creating a workable carbon trading market for agriculture. Some lawmakers have talked about possible legislation along that line. Sonny Perdue says,
I'm a believer in the best solution for sustainability is profitability. And if a carbon trading system is developed, I can assure you that farmers will figure out how to participate in that.
Because he says producers are intelligent business people.
And they will do what's in their best economic interest.
This is Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
By the way, this carbon credit bill was introduced by Senators Mike Braun of Indiana, Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. Well, the Wheat Development Program here at K-State is poised to release 2 new wheat varieties this year, suited largely for central Kansas wheat growing conditions. Marcia Boswell takes a closer look on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
K-State wheat breeder Alan Fritz gave an early report on 2 hard red winter wheat lines expected for release later this year by Kansas State University. Fritz said the 2 new lines planned for central Kansas growing conditions show promise for leaf rust resistance and have performed well in university trials. The varieties aren't named yet, so they're referred to by their experimental numbers. One variety, KS09049K8, is the offspring of 2 Kansas varieties, Duster and Overly, with a little bit of spring wheat from Summit, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center that has a headquarters in Mexico City. Fritz said it's a medium early variety, and it's really the culmination of our efforts to breed race nonspecific lines for leaf rust resistance. This holds up very well to leaf rust. He said the new wheat line is moderately tolerant on acid soils and has very good tillering capacity. The quality of this one is good, and the other thing I like about it is it does have some Hessian fly resistance. The line is moderately susceptible to stripe rust. He said, I would say the resistance is good enough to give you a broader window for fungicide application. With this line, you should have enough stripe rust resistance, so I would put it in the moderately susceptible category. If it's a stripe rust kind of year, like this year in many places, then you would definitely want to put a fungicide on it. While this line has not yet been named, Fritz said he and others are considering a name to honor former U.S. Department of Agriculture entomologist Jim Hatchett, who was based in Manhattan and contributed to wheat breeding in the Great Plains. A second wheat line ready for release is currently known as KS12DH015688, which has lineage connected to an Oklahoma State University wheat named Gallagher. According to Fritz, we're thinking of naming it KS Ahern. This wheat line is a late-maturing variety that has effective levels of leaf and stripe rust resistance. This one is more intermediate on acidic soils, so if you're getting into soils with fairly low pH levels, I might lean toward planting something else. But this one will handle soils with pH levels down to at least 5, and maybe even a little lower than that. He called the quality of this wheat line good but not great, with yield potential on the higher end. He said even though it's a later maturing line, it has performed better in south-central Kansas. Fritz said both of the lines are susceptible to fusarium, and thus he does not suggest either as an option in no-till fields following corn. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And if you'd like to know more about these soon-to-come new K-State wheat variety releases, they were featured in detail on the K-State Virtual Wheat Field Day last week. That's archived on YouTube. Simply search for K-State Wheat Field Day. This is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Turning now on Agriculture Today to the Kansas agricultural weather scene, as we have along with us once more climatologist with K-State Research and Extension, Mary Knapp. Well, we flipped the calendar to the month of June this past week, Mary, but summer just could not hold off in recent days, and we'll talk about that. But you do have the recap for the month of May. What does it tell us?
Well, basically, May was cooler than normal, and we were fairly close to normal on the precipitation. Not surprisingly, there was quite a divide on that. When we talk about temperatures, we started out very, very cool with the lowest temperature reading 24 degrees north of Tribune on the 10th of the month. We exited the month on a very warm note, and Russell Springs took the prize for the highest reading. They hit 99 on the 31st.
And note those two locations are, 20, 30 miles apart from each other?
Very, very close to each other. That very wide temperature swing is also indicative of the drier conditions that prevail in the West. The West Central Division, which houses both of those two locations, was the driest. They averaged only 51% of their normal for the month of May, which is a very poor signal simply because we're moving into our summertime, as you noted. And for summer, convective thunderstorms tend to be the lifeblood, if you will, of the rainfall. And areas that are dry have to work a lot harder to get any convective events going. If you've got an area like the southeast, which has been wet, it's a lot easier to prime the atmosphere and get another storm going.
Southeast Kansas exceeded its normal moisture by a fair amount, you say.
Right. They averaged over 7 inches for the division, and that was 135% of normal. It continues a very long pattern of wetter than normal. You look at Parsons, and Parsons is actually wetter for the year to date than last year at this time, and last year was their wettest year of record. So they're having back-to-back very, very wet patterns. They had flooding issues in that area, not surprisingly with that. There was also some flooding in east central and northeastern Kansas due to individual storms rather than the overall wetness. So the divide still persists, and we are looking at now, as we approach June, a dry pattern setting up, and both sides of the coin may actually have some difficulties with that. It's easy to see where the problems will arise in the west, where they've been dry and continue to be dry. But in the eastern areas of the state that have had a very wet spring, root development on those spring-seeded crops may not be as great as they would in a normal year. That means that they may not be able to follow the water table down as the soils dry out. So that could create some problems, even though there's quite a bit of moisture not very far below the surface.
And for the record, the latest drought monitor shows a widening dry pattern?
Well, the latest drought monitor hasn't reflected much in the way of change. There was a small expansion of the extreme drought in western Kansas. The rest of the areas were pretty much the same as they'd been in the previous, and that's due to the moisture that we had around the 25th of May and carrying it. It takes a while for that to work its way through the drought monitor tools that they use to map that. We did pull back on some of the abnormally dry the previous week in the north central and northeast. So we'll just have to see how these scattered showers deliver. We've had some in the north central and northeastern part of the state the last 2 nights, but the distribution of the moisture has been very spotty.
Well, what's ahead, and hot weather is in store and humid in some locations as well to aggravate that even further.
Right. What we're looking at is we've had some 90s. We may hit the 100-degree mark, particularly in the western parts of the state. But even in the eastern areas, we'll be flirting with that century mark, which will be the first time that we break that 100-degree this year. With the higher humidities, we're likely to see heat index values that are elevated as well. And that's going to be a concern for the livestock, but also for the crops and the stress that those temperatures will have. One thing to note is that when you have those higher humidities, your nighttime lows stay elevated. And we're talking over the weekend that we may have lows in the mid to upper 70s in the eastern part of the state, which is going to be very, very stressful. If you're interested in more details on that, you can check out the Agronomy e-update. We have 2 articles in there this week, one looking at the Animal Comfort Index and how you might utilize that to look at management decisions for your livestock, and a second that looks at the heat in view of previous June heat waves, and in particular, there's already a lot of discussion about 2011.
You're hearing from folks about that because that was a nasty early summer.
Yes, that was a very nasty early summer, and we're already hearing rumbles about, is this going to be a repeat of 2011? And it's interesting to note that already there are differences. In 2011, we started the year on a hot note, and it continued throughout the period. It was also very dry in 2010 to set the stage for 2011. We're going to be seeing a little bit different pattern this year in 2020 because 2019 was wet for the most part, and our spring was actually a spring. We had cooler than normal conditions in April and May, so we're noticing this ramp up a lot more quickly.
We're better off than 11 was at this point. Anyway.
At this point, we're ahead of the game from 2011, although if this weekend forecast verifies, we will have some places that this will be their hottest start to June of record.
See those articles at agronomy.ksu.edu. The e-update link is toward the upper right-hand part of that page. As always, Mary, thanks, and enjoy the weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. Thanks for tuning in, and please be back right here with us on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.